Thanks for listening to the Duval Rundown, brought to you by Injury Care Centers. Your path to recovery starts here. Now here's your host, Gus Logue.
Good morning and welcome to episode 14 of the Duval Rundown show. We got in a little bit of a new layout here with me, O'Brien, our typical Thursday guest. So check us out on YouTube. You can see our beautiful faces, the little new overlay we've got at the bottom. My light's a little wonky because the sunlight is coming right at me. So
that's a good thing that the sunlight's coming right at you, Gus, because we haven't seen the sun, and now I look at the weather this morning for this Sunday's Jaguars game, and apparently we have a 60% chance of rain on Sunday. So I guess the rainy pattern has returned. Not even the hurricane rain, just the whatever that was we experienced most of September. That I blamed the Jaguars 0-3 start, or at least the 0-2 start. I blamed on the fact that we hadn't seen the sun in X amount of days. But no, apparently it's just the reality of they can't score, and their defense, while is okay against the run, not so much against the pass.
Right. Yeah, we're going to dive into all of that. But first, as we start every show, we got to get to a little bit of Jaguars trivia. So this weekend, Tom Coughlin will be inducted into the Pride of the Jaguars at halftime of the game against the Indianapolis Colts. There are currently 7 members in the Pride of the Jaguars. Who is the latest person to be inducted? Was it A, Mark Brunell, B, Jimmy Smith, C, Fred Taylor, or D, Maurice Jones-Drew? The correct answer is B,
is Jimmy
Smith.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
He was inducted in 2016. And actually, it's interesting because I threw a little bit of a curveball in there because MJD has not been inducted, and neither has Keenan McCardell. And so those are two that I think arguably should be in. But yeah, definitely hats off to Tom Coughlin for getting in this weekend. And there's a bunch of stuff on the 1010XL digital channels between interviews with the architect himself, and then interviews with Baselli and Fred Taylor talking about Coughlin, and then even interviews with Cam Robinson and current players talking about just the impact that man has had on the franchise. So definitely go check those out. But Mia, today we're here to talk about the Colts, and specifically the defense, which is run by Gus Bradley, who was once upon a time the head coach for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And so I know that when Gus was in Jacksonville,
let's have the disclaimer out there, Gus, that technically I did not live in Jacksonville. Well, I have met Gus Bradley. I've met him once in person. It was a 2-hour lunch that changed my life because, no, not his cover 3 defense and what it inspired me to want to do. But simply Gus as a person, his philosophies as a leader. I think I speak on behalf of all of Jacksonville when I say we love him as a leader. We love him as a person. The coach, the defense coordinator, that's the part that I think left a lot of Jaguar fans with much to be desired. But I was not here during the Gus Bradley administration. And so that's where I kind of want you to lead us off with your perspective of when you hear Gus Bradley and his defensive scheme. You think what, Gus?
Cover 3, because I agree with you where I don't think anyone has a bad thing to say about Gus Bradley, the person, but a lot of people have bad things to say about his scheme because it's one of those schemes kind of similar to Jim Schwartz that we saw in week 2 against the Browns, where they do what they do, and it's almost a little bit basic at times, but because they're so well coached and know exactly what they're doing, it usually ends up working really well. And we saw that work really well in 2017 when the system was coached really well by Bradley, and they had a ton of talent that came in, whether it was homegrown like Jalen Ramsey and Yannick Ngakoue, or bringing in players like Calais Campbell, Malik Jackson, the safeties, et cetera, et cetera. And so between the talent on that 2017 team, obviously kind of raised the ceiling of what the defense can be. But even in 2017, when the Jaguars produced one of the greatest defenses of the past decade plus, fans were not loving the scheme. I think just because, first of all, you had Jalen Ramsey and AJ Bouye, so theoretically you could match up man-to-man coverage against anyone in the league. And so it would have been nice to see the Jags challenge opposing offenses a little bit more in that regard. But really, it's just that it's a 4-down defense with 3 deep coverage defenders, and then 3 deep back coverage defenders, 4 underneath coverage defenders, and then again a 4-man blitz or 4-man rush. And so it's, what to expect. And Doug Peterson has known what to expect throughout his Jaguars tenure, and same with Trevor Lawrence. I know Trevor is 4-2 against the Colts and 3-0 at home against the Colts, and I'm not sure what his like best completion percentage and passer rating against a single team in his career is, but I think there's a good chance it is the Colts. He typically does very well against this team because they're just so zone heavy, and you just know where you can kind of like pick and choose your spots against this type of defense. And so I do think that Gus has kind of like mixed things up a little bit this year, and even going back to last year and 2 years ago. And so let's start with that. Mia, what do you think is like, just how would you describe Gus Bradley's defense now, and especially compared to like maybe what it's grown into?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this. My boyfriend Kevin, of course, is a lifelong Jaguar fan, and so as I was prepping for our show, I went in the other room earlier. He's off now; he's out of the house. But I had said to him, I go, take a gander at how much cover 3 Gus Bradley is running in 2024, and he was like 70%, something like that. And I said, no, 52.5%. Or 52.4%, excuse me, that still leads the National Football League. It is down, though, Gus, from the 55.5% of the time that the Colts ran cover 3 under Gus Bradley last year, which also led the National Football League. In researching the evolution, though, of Gus's 3 years in Indianapolis as the defensive play caller, they've kind of pinpointed, and by they, I mean all of our contemporaries out there in Indianapolis, have pinpointed last year, week 8, as kind of the defining moment when a Colts team that was struggling was the second worst in the National Football League and allowing explosive plays, which, of course, is a hallmark of cover 3, if not disciplined, quote unquote. If you're not following your assignment enough, then you create the opportunity for more explosive plays. And so they had given up the second most explosive plays in the league heading into week 9 of the 2023 season. And that's when you started to see them use a lot more quarters. That is the second most frequent scheme since week 9 of last year that Gus Bradley and company have employed in Indianapolis. What I'm curious, though, is if you're going to run quarters, you need to have the horses for courses. And when you look at this depth chart right now, beyond the fact that they're without DeForest Buckner due to suspension, beyond the fact that they are without now Tyquan Lewis, who they also lost to the injured reserve, and Samson Ebukam, who they lost before the season even began, I have concerns about that back end, and I think Colts fans have had concerns about their secondary for decades now at this point. Bob Sanders is not walking through that door, unfortunately, and instead you're left with largely day 3 and undrafted free agent guys who, while they've been in your system and you've developed them, you don't have A.J. Boye or Jalen Ramsey. So even if you're not trying to run man, you at the same time have young guys who certainly can play zone, but I'm not so sure that you have enough defensive backs that if you were to be in a dime or, some sort of other exotic coverage, which Gus isn't going to get that exotic, but if he wants to employ and have more defensive backs on the field, I just quite frankly, Gus, don't think they have enough guys that they can play on the field at once, as is, and this is going back to the defensive front, independent of the secondary, Taven Bryan right now is their starting 5-tack. So, look, Jaguar fans, you can do with that information what you will. That's where this is an absolute opportunity for the Jaguars. The reality is that this has always been a defense that is bend, don't break. That's the nature of cover 3. Whether it was his first game against the Colts with Doug Peterson at the helm when Trevor Lawrence absolutely carved them up in a shutout victory. Matt Ryan threw 3 picks that day, so that certainly helped. But the Jaguars were able to truly just take everything underneath and march their way up and down the field. Or comparatively, last year in the second meeting, again, another Colts quarterback that threw 3 interceptions. That time it was Gardner Minshew. But they were able to score 4 offensive touchdowns, 2 through the air, because largely, and I actually went back and listened to the clip from Christian Kirk, Trevor Lawrence and Christian Kirk identified, okay, where can we create those explosive plays given the cover 3 and where we can find soft spots in the zone coverage. And that's where I look at it. And there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And that's kind of what Trevor Lawrence has done when it comes to the Colts. He's taken the stuff that's underneath. The Jaguars have run the ball effectively. We'll get to that here in just a second. And they've also identified, hey, where can we create those explosive plays?
Yeah, I had pretty much the same exact takeaways as you, Mia, because my big thing from looking at the Colts this year is that, of course, it starts with the secondary. They have Kenny Moore II, who continues to be a very solid guy out of the slot, but he is 29 years old and more of just a slot-only corner. And with Juju Brents on injured reserve, who was a recent day 2 draft pick for them.
I feel like he's been on injured reserve his entire career at this point.
Yeah, his whole career, right? Their outside corners are Jalen Jones, Samuel Womack III, Dallas Flowers, and Samuel Womack III is listed again on their official depth chart. So they really don't have a lot of guys. And I think because of that, we've seen like Bradley still runs a ton of zone defense. He runs like zone at a top 3 rate in the league. And he still runs definitely a lot of cover 3 with a single high safety over the top. But he's done a lot more 2 high safety shells, which results in cover 2 or cover 4, as you alluded to with quarters, or cover 6. And so getting more bodies back deep to defend the pass, which I'm sure is partly because of the guys that they have in their secondary, but then also because of the too high trend has been alive and well this season in terms of the just explanation of why scoring is relatively down this season and why defenses are playing well. A large part of the formula is certainly just having 2 high safeties to prevent explosive plays. And so an interesting stat too that I found is that the Colts rank middle of the pack in pretty much every just advanced metric, or even defensive DVOA, EPA per play allowed, success rate allowed, even just yards per play allowed. But they have allowed, so they're mediocre in all of those, but they've allowed the most yards of any team in the NFL this season. And so I think an explanation for that is kind of like what you're saying, where they're a bend don't break defense, and they're going to allow all the short completions up front and allow you to just get 3 to 4 yard completions or plays at a time, and they're really going to make you have to turn down the field. And so even though we've seen kind of like less clicking and less of that type of offense from Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars this season, I do have confidence that they'll be able to march their way downfield with a good amount of success. But to me, like, the real question of this matchup of Jags offense versus Colts defense is what happens in the red zone. And it's definitely hard to predict because the red zone can be pretty fluky and pretty up and down from game to game. But I feel like for the entire Peterson tenure in Jacksonville, the Jags have not been a great offensive or a great red zone offense. And so I think that's going to be big in this game is sustaining drives and obviously kind of like picking up a few first downs, getting into a rhythm, because that's been kind of like what we've been trying to look for on the season as a whole. But I think in this game specifically, the red zone success is going to be a big part of that. And I think the running game is going to be a big part of that potential red zone success. So what were some thoughts that you had on Jacksonville's running game in this matchup?
Yeah, so real quick, in the most recent meeting between these two teams, again, Gardner Minshew threw 3 interceptions, and Josh Hines Allen also forced a fumble. It was recovered by the Jags. So 4 turnovers. We know the Jaguars defense has yet to create a turnover through 4 games this season. And so that is where, when I've looked at the recent history of this matchup, some of the Jaguars' more dominating victories have been by virtue of 4 turnovers forced in each of the last 2 home meetings in Jacksonville between these two teams. And so I think that's important to note, because part of why the Jaguars have dominated this series of late is because of their ability to take the ball away, and they have not been able to do that. Maybe they are able to, lightning strikes twice in the same place 3 times, and they finally are able to create turnovers. But if Joe Flacco is going to be under center for the Colts, it might be a little bit more difficult. If it's Anthony Richardson, we'll see. We'll see what happens. To your point about the red zone, in the most recent meeting, 2 of the Jaguars' 4 touchdowns came in the red zone. That was a Travis Etienne inside the 10-yard line, in between the tackles, run, hit the edge, actually created by Brandon Scherf. So we'll give Scherf a little bit of credit here. So that was the first touchdown. It was an ETM Wildcat touchdown that Tank Bigsby handed the ball off to him. Very creative play call there. And then the Christian Kirk touchdown I alluded to. And then finally the second red zone touchdown, which was to Brenton Strange, which I remember saying it, I'm pretty sure to you, Gus, in the press box. That was Trevor Lawrence's 4th progression. And I remember looking and saying, all right, he's going through progressions. There's no question. Now, that was in October of 2023. Here we are in October of 2024. And the question of, is Trevor Lawrence going through his progressions? Is he too sped up? It is very much alive and well, that question of, is that reality, but we have seen it. I went back and I watched the highlights from that game. He can read, he can go through progressions. And one of those came courtesy, his fourth read was to Bretton Strange and that touchdown. To the point about the run game, I'm going to kick it back to you first, Gus. I find it interesting because when I've spoken to Colts people around the Colts organization, they have been so perplexed by the idea of a defense that was, even despite all its flaws in 2022, in which they picked fourth in the NFL draft that ensuing April, they were fifth in yards per rush attempt allowed. They were 10th in yards per rush attempt allowed last year. And that was despite early on in both those seasons creating some among the league leaders in turnovers and fumbles, yet they couldn't stop the run despite having individual performers like Grover Stewart and DeForest Buckner who could stop the run. And then you go to the first 2 weeks of this season in which they allowed 5.3 yards per carry, over 200 yards to the Houston Texans, 4.9 yards per carry, over 250 yards to the Green Bay Packers. And now each of the last two times out, they've found much more success, but I have questions about it because their first win of the season, in which they allowed 2.3 yards per carry to the Chicago Bears and 63 total rushing yards. That's a Chicago offense that has struggled to find its identity when it comes to its ground game. They also have an offensive line that has a lot of questions. So that's number one. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Colts allowed 122 rushing yards on 30 attempts, but that was still a 4.1 yard per carry clip. And much of those yards came after the Colts had built a 17-3 lead. And in the second half of a ball game in which you'd think the Pittsburgh Steelers are playing from behind, they would want to throw the ball through the air. And so that's why, as much as Colts fans are like, okay, cool, we figured out the run defense after those first two abysmal weeks, which you could even point to the Green Bay game and say it was situational because Malik Willis was making his first start, masterclass by Matt LaFleur. But then you look at that second half last week, and that's where I have questions. And it says to me, can the Colts run defense still be exposed even if they've corrected things from those first 2 weeks of the season?
Yeah, my big question is just how explosive can the Jaguars be on the ground against the Colts? Because I have confidence that they'll be able to maintain a high success rate just based on what the Colts defense has looked like so far this year, and then also what the Jags offense has looked like this year. And I know that Tank Bigsby had a 58-yard run last week, but I feel like I don't know if Travis Etienne has registered a 20-plus yard carry so far this season. And so I'd be looking for that. Is that I think Etienne, especially since week one and in recent weeks, has been really good at just churning out 4 or 5 yards at a time and kind of keeping the offense ahead of schedule and ahead of the chains and all that stuff. But it would be good to see just a more well-rounded attack in terms of like mixing the down-to-down efficiency with some really big plays too. Again, like that Tank play last week that set the Jaguars up in the red zone. And then, of course, they weren't able to capitalize for a few various reasons. But to get something like that, that'll set you up at the 2-yard line, or just it'll make things a lot easier. And so that's kind of like the biggest thing I'm looking for from Jacksonville's run game this week, is that I expect them to end up with, like, at the end of the game, having like a pretty good number in terms of yards per carry. But I think like they really need to just break off a few long runs in order to help out Trevor Lawrence and like have him not get impatient, because it's really the Colts defense, their pass defense, really just tests the opposing quarterback's patience as much as anything, because they're like basically allowing them to take the boring, easy, short completions the entire game. And so as long as Trevor sticks with that and the run game is both efficient and explosive, then I think the Jaguars offense will have the best showing of the season so far.
Yeah, it's all about the discipline. And I remember discussing that week 2 of the 2022 season. Not that Trevor wasn't disciplined in the opener that year against Washington, but this idea of you just have to take what they give you. Yes, you want to push the ball downfield. Yes, you want to try the home run ball. But the reality is, if they're going to give you those 5, 6, 7-yard completions, and watching back some of the tape against the Houston Texans, and again, that was their opener, so I think the Colts have made adjustments. But to the point about off-zone coverage, like the Texans were lined up in shotgun on the Colts 4-yard line, and the Colts defensive backs were quite literally somehow, some way, again, this is on their own 4-yard line, they were giving the Texans wide receivers 10 yards, like literally giving them all the space in the world that all CJ Stroud had to do was quick swing pass, boom, walk into the end zone, because they were playing so off that they were basically at the touchline. And again, maybe that's just a miscue by a young defensive back that, because of depth is forced into starting action. But that says to me that, and I know you and Frank Frangie talked about this on Tuesday's episode of Duval Rundown, Gus, if Trevor Lawrence is missing high and if he's missing long, it's a little bit of a concern because they're a little bit further. The defender is, so far off. But if he can just keep it within 2-3 yards of his receiver, they are playing so far off that you're going to have that wiggle room to operate within. You just have to take what they're giving you. And so that discipline, I think, is going to be essential for the Jaguars to have their best offensive showing of the season. And to your point about the explosive run plays, the Colts are currently tied for the worst in the National Football League and allowing 40-plus yard run plays this year with 3. And again, I think a lot of that comes by virtue of the Texans and the Packers and the massacre that was on the ground in the first 2 weeks of the season for the Colts defense. But yes, there certainly is an opportunity there to be had. I do want to note that Grover Stewart, I want to continue to give him his flowers. According to ESPN Analytics, he is a top 5 run defender this year. Coming into last week, he was number 1 in the National Football League in win rate. He was 5th in double team rate. And I'm very curious to see how a Jaguars interior 3 that was challenged last week somehow, some way against Mario Edwards and Foley Fatukasi, how they respond after last week's showing, especially knowing that outside of Kwity Paye and Laiatu Latu, I mentioned it earlier, Taven Bryan is the 4th starting defensive lineman in this scheme. So I think there's an opportunity to be had there for a Jaguars offensive line that appeared to find its footing as a collective last week, even if the interior 3 had questions in the run game during the course of Sunday's loss to Houston.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add is that it's also important for the Jaguars to be explosive with their pass game too, because I'm confident that they'll be efficient. It's the same thing with the rushing offense where, like, even if the way to beat this Colts defense is to just kind of like march down the field and be efficient in the red zone, you still got to be able to have a couple like well-called and well-executed shot plays as well to kind of keep them on their toes and maybe get more single or 2 safety coverages back there, because like Gus Bradley's defense, the part of the reason he likes to do 1 high cover 3 is that hypothetically it has an answer for every problem, where since he only has 1 deep safety, then that's an extra guy in the box to help fit the run and defend the run. And then since he has not just the 1 deep safety, but then the 2 cornerbacks are also playing deep thirds, then that's taking away the deep passing attack too for the most part. And so he's kind of sort of solving both problems with that base cover 3 defense. But if like the Jaguars are ripping off explosive runs, then maybe we see him lean more into that, where we talked about earlier. He's going into more 2 high safety coverages this year because of the lack of secondary talent, but he'll have to go into more 1 high safety coverages and bring that second safety into the box if the Jaguars are having an efficient and explosive running game. And so it's imperative for the Jaguars to take advantage of that when that happens and be able to get a shot play over the top, especially considering how good Brian Thomas Jr. has looked this year and how relatively undermanned the Colts are with their secondary. And this is a point that Campo and Joe were making on their podcast earlier this week, which I thought was a great show, just talking about what the problems are with the team as a whole. But they were talking about how there's like just a few plays in each game that really just changes the course of each game. And for the Texans game last week, it was Trevor's 2 overthrows to Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas Jr. And so, like, yes, the entire game plan or like the focus and everything like that is just to be efficient against this Colts defense and just take what they're giving you, because they're going to give you stuff. But at the same time, I just want to make it clear that for both the running game and the passing game, you still got to get those explosive plays.
Yeah, and I do want to note to your point about bringing a safety in the box to try to crowd it if a team is having success in the run game, and then the opportunity, therefore, because they bring an extra defender, that you can create a deep shot to a Brian Thomas Jr., Gus. Colts fans were losing their minds against the Packers for obvious reasons, because it was Malik Willis. Of the 261 rushing yards that the Packers amassed in that week 2 meeting, 237 of them came before halftime. And then magically at halftime, and granted at that point, the Packers, I guess, had built an insurmountable lead. I think they were only up by 2 scores at that point, but it was insurmountable. And that's when you saw Nick Cross come into the box after halftime. And from that moment forth, the Colts allowed just 24 rushing yards in the second half. So it's not that they can't make adjustments. It's that they sometimes just, wait till halftime. So all the more reason that just like the last 2 meetings in which the Jaguars built a pretty hefty halftime lead, get off to that fast start. We not only heard that from the players on offense in the Jaguars locker room yesterday, as well as last week, and you saw it against the Texans, heard it from the Jaguars defense as well, that you need to have a fast start in order to build a lead that, would force not only the Colts defense into precarious situations, but whoever the quarterback is as well.
Absolutely. All right. I think we've got the Gus Bradley's defense figured out for the most part. And
we do.
While you're on, though, I did want to talk about Tom Coughlin, and especially Doug Peterson's quote recently about the coaching style that he has. And Coughlin himself talked about it with Dan and Jeff on those videos that I referenced that are on 1010XL Jaguars YouTube pages that you can go and watch right now. But just Tom Coughlin was, for lack of a better word, excuse my language, a hard ass, and just like really I don't know. I can't really find a better way to describe it than that. Like, he was just really on players' cases. Tony Baselli told a good story about just like how strict he was in terms of what players could wear, and everyone like matching the same color socks, not no one having different color socks. And so he definitely had his process and coached hard. And nowadays, as Peterson was referencing this week when he was talking to media, that style of coaching has kind of gone away a little bit because, I mean, these are grown men that you're coaching and that you're talking to. And now in this just era of, I don't know, player empowerment, not just in the NFL, but across a bunch of different leagues, I feel like we see it the most in the NBA. Players aren't going to take that anymore. They want a real adult-to-adult conversation and someone that's going to, like, really teach them and, I don't know, guide them as opposed to just barking at them. And so, I don't know. To me, I think that style of coaching, it can still take place as long as the player knows that you care. Because if you're just barking just to bark and to be loud and to try to get something different out of them, then that's not going to work. And it probably wouldn't have worked back then, but especially not now in today's game. But I think that, like, I don't know. I don't think Dan Campbell is necessarily like as hardwired as a coach, but like if Dan Campbell like just lit into his players randomly after one practice session, then I don't think any Lions players would really like take it poorly because they know how much Dan Campbell cares about each individual player on that team and the team as a whole. And so they understand kind of like where it's coming from. And to me, that's like the most important thing is just where it's coming from. And then like coaches can coach in various ways. But at the same time, I think that also in this new era or whatever, the best way to coach is to like, even if you're barking and players know that you care, the best way is to kind of like change up your coaching based on which player it is that you're coaching.
Right. And so I'm going to punt this back to you, Gus, and I'm going to ask you before I give my take. Name for me a single coach in the National Football League right now in 2024 who you would say is a traditional hard-ass Tom Coughlin style coach.
I mean, the only one I feel like I can really think of is like maybe Bill Belichick,
which he's not coaching right now.
Yeah, but he's not coaching right now. The other name I thought of was like Mike Tomlin, but that's really just because he's been around for a while. I don't think Mike Tomlin really, like maybe a little bit, but I don't think he totally falls into that category. And then
I think you could even go to like the veteran guys, the old guard of John Harbaugh and Andy Reid, who of course are from the same tree, because it's the Andy Reid tree, as Doug Peterson. And those guys aren't hard asses. Like maybe Brian Daboll, yes, and credit to Dell, of course, one of our friends in the chat line right now. Vrabel would be the other one. Tomlin is just such a weird case study because they're tired of him in Pittsburgh, yet they keep winning, and the rest of the National Football League thinks he's a god. So, like, Tomlin's a weird one. To your point about Dan Campbell, because I think when the Jaguars were winning, you could put Doug Peterson in the same category, and I actually think you could put Kyle Shanahan and some of his descendants of his tree in this category as well. when the Jaguars were winning / in 2022, when they were still growing and learning Doug and learning to find themselves, Doug was definitely hands-off players coach. Last year, when they started 1-2, I vividly remember hearing from multiple people that at halftime of that Texans game, if you remember week 3, when the Jaguars, for whatever the reason, for lack of a better term, viewed the Texans as Charleston Southern and thought it was a game that they'd be able to sleepwalk through, and Doug lit into them at halftime. Multiple people that were in that locker room said to me after, that is the most angry I have ever seen Doug. And it hit home because you're so used to Doug being level-headed, consistent, that when he does all of a sudden spike to hard-ass Doug, it means more. And I think you could take the football out of it. I think that natural leadership coaching, by being consistent when you do raise your voice, it's not like you're being tuned out because that's the level you're at every single day. There's a clear contrast. And so it makes the brain recognize, oh no, something is wrong here. This is not what I am used to. And so that I think is where you're seeing this new age of coaching heading towards, because guys are taught / want to be that consistent. I'm the same guy every day for my players, and I want my players to have input and we can have open conversations. When they do spike to that level, it means a little something extra, as opposed to being like TC, who was up there all the time, or a Mike Vrabel, who perhaps, whether he was outwardly yelling or not, was up here the majority of the time. And even then, I think Vrabel really softened as time goes on. And I'm not calling Vrabel soft by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, well, I'm sure we'll get into it at some point. I know you and Hayes did 2 weeks ago. If we do go down that road of the Jaguars need a new coach, I think Mike Vrabel should be among the first phone calls. I think when I say he has softened, I mean that to that point of being more receptive to a conversation and not just it's my way or the highway. I think you saw that with Vrabel down the stretch. Now, did you see that with Vrabel behind the scenes with Rand Carthen and the rest of the Tennessee Titans top brass? That I don't know. I'm not as familiar with, exactly how the inner workings, only the surface level. And from what I know from the surface level, a little bit of friction there. And Vrabel had no issue voicing his opinion. So I think it's interesting, though, and that's why I asked you the exercise of, can you name who the biggest hard ass would be right now in coaching is? Because, I mean, we could go up and down the league, like maybe Brian Daboll, which even then, like.
Yeah, I was thinking like him and Sean Payton a little bit, but they're also like offensive genius type too.
And they get this idea of, well, they're quarterback whisperers. They have great conversations. And Daboll, it's a little bit different because given who his quarterback is. But Sean Payton was regarded as, while he's a hard ass, him and Drew Brees worked in perfect harmony. And it wasn't this, it's my way or the highway. I'm the coach. I'm the GM. I make the rules.
The only other one I thought of was the Minnesota Vikings defensive coordinator, Brian Flores, who's, of course, a coordinator and not a head coach. But he's
part of why he's not a head coach anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I don't know. He is arguably the best coordinator in the league right now. Like, that Vikings defense is pretty special. And so that's interesting. But, yeah, it's kind of gone away from that for sure, where I think you kind of nailed it, where it's like less of my way and the highway and more of just being not necessarily more interactive with the players, because it's not like there wasn't interaction before, but just really hearing out the players' side more often. Because I feel like in the past, if you heard out the player's side, it's like you didn't really care what the player had to say because the player was just straight up wrong and they needed to fix it. But at this point, it's more of like listening to their perspective and even taking some of their advice and making it more of a two-way street, as Doug also quoted recently, even though he was talking about something else. But yeah, I think it's just more of a two-way street in terms of communication and approach, rather than, as you're saying, my way or the highway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of why you can have a Brian Flores be the way he is because you have Kevin O'Connell running the operation. You have Kwesi running from the personnel perspective, and both those guys are so much more cool-headed, so to speak. And I do think the Brian Flores effect, like you're seeing it across the National Football League. The fact that Tua has been so vocal, Austin Jackson has been so vocal about how they didn't respond to that type of coaching. And I think it's affecting young coaches and how they approach the game. I mean, I can speak again from, being an academic coach in the leadership department at UNF, it's affected how I've tried to learn more about leadership and how I try to lead our department at 1010, because it is the way we're headed. And sure, for some old heads like Dan in the Facebook chats, that may, that may be upsetting, this idea of, being soft. But it's not about being soft. It's about having a conversation. And yes, Mike, thank you. Great response on Facebook. It's about being treated as men, but then the idea of, hey, I'm an adult. Treat me like an adult. Let's have an adult conversation. And I think maybe that's the millennial effect. I won't say Gen Z because they're Gen Zers are in a different department. But I think it's the millennial effect of, hey, I want a seat at the table. Like, I sit at the adult table because I went through so much crap from 9/11 on as a young, formative, in my formative years, that I want to have those adult conversations. And I think that's where we are as a society, not just the National Football League. To Dell's point about TC, and this is where I'll leave it before Gus takes you guys through group chat therapy and the rest of the show. Leon gave a great anecdote on XL Primetime on 1010 XL yesterday. Not the idea, which, to Dell's point, Michael Strahan called Leon and was like, what the hell is this guy's problem up in New York when TC got there? He's like, this guy's got to chill out. And Leon said, dude, this is him chilled out comparatively. And TC did find another level of chill thanks to Michael Strahan and, of course, a Super Bowl winning Giants defense in 2008. But Leon told the story. And this is what I'll leave you guys with for those who are concerned about the Jags locker room, even though the players dispelled that notion yesterday, and that is also available on our digital channels. Leon said it wasn't that the Jaguars in 1996 didn't believe in Tom Coughlin. They believed in him as a coach, but they were sick and tired of the yelling, making them go full pad Friday, like they were beaten down. And so they almost like joined together, and they almost played in spite of their head coach, even though they were playing for him, if that makes sense. They developed this attitude of, look, he's crazy. We're going to have the adult conversation with him if he needs to lighten up. But ultimately, regardless of if he lightens up or not, we are together and we are unified, and we're going to play for each other, and maybe not playing for our coach. But I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, because you shouldn't be trying to, go to college, where how many times do we say to young college kids, you should be playing for your university that you chose, not for the coach that you're playing for. And I think it's similar to that. And so as far as the Jags go, that's, I think, part of why I walked out of the locker room yesterday with a complete 180 of feelings than I did the week prior as a media member. This group clearly has found something amongst themselves, whether you want to include the coaching staff in that, or if it's just simply player driven. There was something that came out of that Texans loss on Sunday that was different than the 3 previous losses, that I know the hope is that it'll catapult them to their first victory of the season on Sunday. But the fact that Leon even said that, and Leon's been very critical of the approach across the board. And if you haven't listened, go ahead. 2 to 4, XL Primetime, today 12 to 2. But the fact that he brought that up, and of course we know what the 1996 Jaguars ended up doing. They went to an AFC championship game against all odds, and they made a postseason run, even if it was by courtesy of a miss by one of the greatest field goal kickers of all time. It says that it can be done. Even if there's frustration, you can find yourselves and you can find each other and rally as a team. And I'm not suggesting the Jaguars should be, playing in spite of Doug Peterson. I'm not saying that. But the point is that it can be done in terms of, hey, you know what? We've got each other. We have our coaches and we trust our coaches, but we have to be together. And I think it was interesting to hear that from Leon yesterday. So I will leave you all with that. And I don't think that is weak and soft by saying, hey, I got you, you got me, and that's all that matters at the end of the day.
I almost feel like that's what could happen this week because of this video that I'm about to play during the show and tell segment of just like a report that Doug has lost the locker room. I kind of feel like that's going to be a spark for the team that they kind of needed. And almost like what you were just saying, where it's like, we're playing for Doug Peterson, but we're really just playing for each other and ourselves and for the team. Like, we're still NFL players. We still have the season to play, even if it's unlikely that we make the playoffs at this point. Like, let's band together and show that, no, the locker room isn't lost, that we're still a bunch of dogs and that we're still a team to be that's like shouldn't be just swept under the rug. We're still the Jaguars, which, yeah, they're the Jaguars, but we're to be reckoned with, basically. And so I'll be interested to see if that's a little bit of a spark for them this weekend. But yeah, Mia, thank you for coming on. Thank you, as always, for all of your insight and for providing today's just topics. Thought it was pretty interesting. Looking forward to seeing you on Sunday for the inductment and the game.
Absolutely, sir. And if anybody has any other thoughts, you can leave them in the chats even after our program if you're watching on archive, if you're watching on demand. And if you also enjoy our lovely new design template, please let me know, because if everyone likes it, we can move a lot of our other podcasts to this display.
All right, Mia, we'll catch you next time. Thanks again.
Bye.
All righty, guys. Now it's time for some show and tell. So, as I said, I was going to show a clip that definitely made its rounds around Jags Twitter.
This is a franchise that is completely rudderless, a GM that, to me, has no synergy with the head coach, and a head coach, again, in Doug Peterson, who is going to be the scapegoat. You know, it really could not be worse in Jacksonville. The roster right now is built to win. The way they have structured it, the way they paid guys, offensively, defensively, Armstead, Campbell, Lawrence, Burns, Allen, Hines Allen. I just don't see any scenario where this is going to get better. And if you're Doug Peterson, a Super Bowl winning coach, Warren, you need to look in the mirror, in my opinion, and take responsibility. I'll leave you with this. I've talked to a few guys in that locker room over the last 2 weeks, not just the Texans game, but the last couple weeks. And they've told me that locker room is gone in regards to the head coach. So when I hear that, I hear, again, a team and a franchise that is absolutely rudderless.
So, as YouTube or stream viewers can see, that was NFL insider Jordan Schultz on the Warren Sharp football show. And Doug responded to that claim or that report in a press conference yesterday. Here it is via Jaguars YouTube.
Lost the locker room. Do you have any response to that? And would you even know if you've lost the locker room?
Yeah, I would know. I talk to these guys every day. I see them every day. And no, I have not lost the locker room. I think these guys have done everything I've asked. They continue to play and practice hard and battle, and you know, it's a good group. It's a good group. The right leaders in there, and they know what we need to do, and you know, they're not making excuses for it, and I'm not going to make excuses, and we just got to go do it.
Here is Trevor Lawrence addressing the same question again via Jaguars YouTube.
The locker room, and I just want to ask you, what is your observations about any change in terms of the relationship in that regard?
I mean, I shouldn't even have to. You got to do your job, so you got to ask it. But I shouldn't even have to answer it. I mean, not at all. I don't know where that's coming from, so I don't even want to really expand on something that's just not true. So.
Well, there you go. I'm actually inclined to believe Trevor and Doug, because even when people from the team stand up at press conferences, especially during the season, then not necessarily always inclined to tell the truth. But I mean, as them two said, as Mia just said, as I've seen in other people in the locker room, I don't think the locker room is really lost. I think maybe Schultz did say they talked to players in the last 2 weeks, so maybe after the Bills game, a couple players were reeling. But as Mia told us on the post-game show after the Texans game, it was actually a pretty positive locker room, or at least relative to expectations. And so even though certainly it seems like a lost season at this point, I don't think the locker room is quite lost. And so on to more positive things, I guess. Here's Trevor talking about Brian Thomas Jr.
How he's responded to like more being added to his plate the last couple of weeks.
He's done a great job. You know, he's been prepared. He's known the plan. Obviously, his skill set and talents, you see him every week, and his ability to really just do everything that we need him to do. Win down the field, get open, create separation, you know, and he's done a great job of that all season. So I thought Sunday was one of his best games and should have been even bigger. You know, we had some more opportunities down the field that we're going to connect on in the future. So it's exciting watching him play and just seeing how much better he's gotten through the first 4 games. I mean, he's still so young. I think 21, 22. I don't know when his birthday is, but so it's going to be fun to see him just keep getting better.
Doug mentioned his competitiveness on the field, especially after big plays. Man, just what have you seen just outside of him?
Just shows up and plays. Like he makes the plays that come to him. You know, like we've said the whole time, doesn't talk too much. You know, he's kind of a quieter guy, but then on the field he just comes alive, and you see some of that spark and some of that competitiveness when he makes plays. You see the celebrating or whatever it is, and he'll let the DB know about it. So it's cool to watch the quarterback and to see a guy that's really fired up to play and loves the game.
Has he come out of his shell at all off the field with you guys?
Definitely, yeah. He's come out a little bit. He's just a quieter guy naturally, but he's definitely come out of his shell. He's talking more in meetings and just when we watch some tape after practice and all those things and just hanging out with the guys. He's starting to be around a little bit more. So, yeah, he's definitely coming out of his shell. I think naturally just more of an introverted guy, which is, you know, everybody's different. So it's been great getting to know him.
Last video clip for today is via Colts YouTube. This is Gus Bradley talking about the Jaguars offense, which I just thought would be interesting since me and I just talked about Gus Bradley's defense.
Lawrence has always been a guy who gets the ball out of his hands really quickly. In this matchup, he tends to do that against you guys a good amount. So kind of knowing that going in, what's going to be key to either making him hold the ball more or be able to kind of handle him when he is throwing that quickly?
Well, you're right. I mean, they do both, right? They take their shots. They had a couple shots against Houston that, you know, were just off the fingertips or overthrown a little bit. So that, you know, they kind of do a combination. It feels like, you know, once he gets into a rhythm, you know, he starts getting into a rhythm. He's really good. So it's going to be important for us to understand. You know, we know there's the quick game, the RPOs, but there's the shots too. And he's got a lot of threats on the perimeter, a lot of guys. He doesn't go to one guy, but you know, he feels comfortable to use all of his weapons. So, you know, we're seeing him back there play with some poise. They just have, you know, had some misfortune. But it's still, when you watch it, I mean, it is a coordinated offense, and you can see what they want to do. They want to get a run game going, you know, get the ball out of his hands, get it to the skilled players. There's just been a couple plays here and there that have kept them from being in a situation where, you know, they were to start with a better record.
Pretty good insight, in my opinion. Let's get some screen grabs and other stuff. Let's see if I can get myself in here. There I am. So here's a tweet from Gene Fournette that says, quote, "Talked to several Jaguars players about media report that Coach Doug Peterson has lost the locker room, and each strongly denied that was the case. The one-word response from Darnell Savage was this, cap." So, yeah, again, I think we can kind of dumb that one down to a little bit of a non-story. The next one is snap at motion, or motion at the snap, and then motion before the snap rates via ESPN Analytics and Seth Water on Twitter. And so you can see here for viewers, stream viewers, that Jacksonville ranks 31st with motion that's at the snap at 9.6%. And then their just motion rate at all, whether it's mostly, I mean, I guess their motion rate before the snap, they rate 48.9% usage. And I'm not sure where that ranks. That's more of the middle of the pack. But again, the Jaguars rank 31st in usage of motion at the snap. And so I just thought that was interesting because, yeah, not really a ton of help for Trevor or the offense without getting as much kind of pre-snap indicators. So, yeah, just something I saw on Twitter and thought was interesting. This comes from an ESPN Plus article where NFL insiders Dan Graziano and Jeremy Fowler were talking about potential NFL trade deadline moves that could happen, especially with the recent moves around Davante Adams in Las Vegas. And then I feel like there was another piece of league-wide news too. Just that the Chiefs are obviously in the market for some kind of offensive weapon, since now Marquise Brown is out for the entire regular season and Rashee Rice possibly tore his ACL last Sunday. And so Graziano said, quote, "Cooper would be one to watch, as in Amari Cooper would be one to watch for Pittsburgh. That would be an in-division trade, and those are tough to execute. I would expect the Steelers to be in on Davante Adams along with DeAndre Hopkins if he becomes available. And I do wonder about Christian Kirk in Jacksonville." And Fowler added, "Another loss or two could leave the 0-4 Jaguars trading away players. This roster is not barren. I could see teams inquiring on rookie scale talent, such as linebacker Devin Lloyd, safety Andre Sisco, and running back Travis Etienne Jr. I'm not saying Jacksonville wants to move marquee players, but we've seen this script before when a team implodes. The Jaguars have 3 starting caliber offensive tackles, with Walker Little as the odd man out. They always seem to need offensive line help and will make calls accordingly. So I don't really expect the Jaguars to make a move, even if at this point they seem like they'd be more of sellers rather than buyers at the deadline. I definitely wouldn't expect any moves to happen until the week of the trade deadline, because that's just normally the case in the league. And the NFL trade deadline this year is November 5th, I believe, but it's definitely in the first week of November. So don't expect any action until then. But I will say that I think while Christian Kirk kind of seems like the front runner as the most likely to be traded, if anyone is traded from the Jaguars, because I think there was a previous report too, which might have been from Graziano, but yeah, I'll just say that I think Devin Lloyd is probably the most likely to be traded because apparently Seattle Seahawks general manager John Schneider has been interested in Lloyd for a little bit, and I just think that especially with just surprisingly good play from Ventrell Miller this season too, then yeah, maybe we see Devin Lloyd kind of get a fresh start somewhere else, and specifically maybe in Seattle. Looks like we got a Jets fan in the comments. He said Devontae wants to come to the Jets because he wants to be linked back with Aaron Rodgers. Devontae doesn't want to go to the Saints to be with Derek Carr. Look at how that worked for him last time. Yeah, that was pretty brutal of him to want to play with his college quarterback in Derek Carr and then going to the Raiders and having Carr be cut one off season later. But yeah, I agree with you, Jets fan, in the comments of the Jaguars show that I expect Tay to be either not traded or traded to the Jets at this point. Although the Steelers should definitely do something. Like, I love George Pickens, but I don't know. Their offense could take another step if they got another guy. Next slide is just the injury report from Wednesday of this week. Just thought it was noticeable because Devin Lloyd did not practice due to a knee injury that caused him to be out for last week. And Josh Hines-Allen did not practice also because he's in concussion protocol from Sunday. But the Jags had a few limited practices otherwise from Yasir Abdullah, Tank Bigsby, Gabe Davis, Evan Engram, who could return this week from hamstring injury, Travis Etienne, Jarnian Jones, and Darnell Savage, who could also return this week from a quad injury. Meanwhile, the Colts' Anthony Richardson was limited with his oblique/hip injury, and so as more time has gone on since last Sunday, I think it's more likely that Richardson is actually able to suit up this Sunday against the Jaguars, especially since I've heard that if it was a playoff game or something like that, Anthony Richardson would have been able to go back in last week, but because the Colts are already up 17-0 against the Steelers, they just kept him out and ended up still being able to win that game. But for the Colts, players who did not practice Wednesday include linebacker Zaire Franklin, those just due to illness, center Ryan Kelly, who was out last week, cornerback Kenny Moore, defensive end Kwity Paye, offensive tackle Braden Smith, linebacker Grant Stewart, and running back Jonathan Taylor, who had a mild ankle sprain on last Sunday. And so Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson are obviously the biggest injuries to monitor on the Colts side this week, but there's also a good chunk of other important injuries on both sides that, again, important to monitor. The last slide is just a tweet from Jamal St. Cyr of News for Jacks. Trevor Lawrence at home against the Colts has 639 total yards passing, 6 passing touchdowns, 73.9 completion percentage, 109.8 quarterback rating, and a 3-0 record. And so, as I was saying with Mia earlier, I think one of the teams that Trevor has played best against in his career, if not the team that he has played the best against in his career, is the Colts, and especially at home. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see if he can kind of use this week as a get-right game. So before we get to some chat therapy and answer some chat questions, here's a brief ad break. Alrighty. Hello again. Let's see what we have in the comments. Good morning, Dell. Sorry I didn't see your comment earlier, but appreciate you tuning in. Dell asked, when Trent gets inducted to the Pride, will they play Many Men during the reveal? I mean, couldn't have it any other way, right? I love that on Twitter there's like this, I don't even know, like a meme or something like that. It was basically like a AI generated thing where I think it was like, was it Lil Yachty or it was someone, I don't think it was Lil Yachty. It was like a rapper basically like dancing on a stage. And then there was some kind of AI website where you could change who the rapper was and have it just be like Scooby-Doo or Trent Baalke or whoever that was like dancing on the stage. And so there was one of Trent Baalke like firing up the crowd that just makes me laugh every time. And that wasn't to the song of Many Men, but yeah, Many Men is a classic in relation to the current architect of the Jaguars. 100 miles per hour asked, Gus, how funny is it going to be when Joe Flacco destroys Ryan Nielsen, the almighty god of defenses, his defense? Yeah, it'll be pretty funny. I think that a lot of Jags fans this week have been like, oh, we would rather play Anthony Richardson than Joe Flacco, which is probably because Anthony Richardson, while he has all the talent in the world, he hasn't quite harnessed it yet, and he's still fairly, I don't think raw is the right way to describe him, because he's actually pretty good in terms of like pocket management and process and a lot of different things that I think he doesn't get as much credit for as he should be, but he is certainly inexperienced, and he certainly makes bad decisions from time to time and is more susceptible to turn the ball over than Joe Flacco, who torched the Jaguars last year as a member of the Cleveland Browns in week 12-ish when the Jags went up to Cleveland and lost the game without Christian Kirk, I think, because excuse me, maybe it was closer to week 14 because I feel like I remember Kirk not playing in that game. But yeah, anyway, as a member of the Browns last year, Flacco just completely killed the Jags with a lot of like deep play action shots, just like wide open deep shots. And so I think Jags fans this week have been like, oh, we would rather play Anthony Richardson, but I don't know. We've got a Colts fan in the office at 1010XL, Trent Osborne, who does a lot of behind the scenes stuff for us, especially on the YouTube side. And he was saying, because he is a Colts fan, so he watches each game, that actually Anthony Richardson was way more impressive against the Steelers because he got them the 17-0 lead, and Flacco kind of basically just came in and got the job done. And even though he finished with 100 or 200 yards passing and 2 touchdowns on Sunday, it wasn't really all that impressive. And so I actually think that the Jaguars will be a better match against Joe Flacco, just because even if he might be a more experienced passer and a better passer and might be able to spread the ball out a little bit better, he's just such a statue back there. And so even if Hines Allen isn't going to be available for this game for the Jaguars, like the pass rush has not been as good as it needs to be this season. And so I think it'll help them to go against a 39-year-old quarterback in Joe Flacco, if that is the case. But I mean, if Flacco destroys Nielsen's defense, yeah, I guess that'll be pretty funny. I don't know how many people will be chuckling in Northeast Florida, but maybe after a couple of days. What else do we got in the comments? 100 miles per hour asked, Gus, why is Mason Smith not getting more reps? I have definitely been watching more offensive all-22 film than defenses to try to figure out Trevor Lawrence this season. But for Mason Smith, I think it's all about consistency. And he talked about that going into the season, actually, where that's like the biggest thing he wanted to work on. He said that he felt the best he had felt in years and was super confident going into the season. But the main thing he was trying to work on was consistency, especially since he would have told you himself that he wasn't super consistent at his last year at LSU because he was coming off of a major ACL tear. And so I think consistency, he would say himself, is like the reason that he's not getting more reps is that we've all seen flashes from him already this season through 4 games from the second round pick, but just on a down-to-down basis, not using the correct technique or fundamentals that Nielsen is coaching. And so I did say with Frangie on the Tuesday show that even though the defensive line has been maybe the most underwhelming unit of this season, I'm also perhaps the most optimistic about that unit for the rest of the season, just because Nielsen is so renowned for coaching those fundamentals and techniques on the defensive line. And so maybe as Smith just gets more time with the coaching staff, including Nielsen, he'll continue to get more playing time. But yeah, it's just a consistency thing where we've seen the flashes, but he needs to not necessarily not win on every single down, because you can't ask any player to do that. Not even his prime Aaron Donald, he would win on the majority of his reps, but still not all of his reps. And so it's not necessarily about winning the reps for Mason Smith, but I guess it's more so about not losing the reps and not being out of the place and not allowing yards and stuff like that. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much time he gets moving forward. But the only other thing I'll add is that at this point, I think everyone knows that Eric Armstead is basically splitting snaps between defensive tackle and edge rusher. And the same thing is actually happening to Roy Robertson Harris now, where Robertson Harris is playing more edge snaps as well. And I don't know if that's to make up for the lack of edge rush or to make up for Hines Allen. I mean, actually, Robertson Harris was playing on the edge before Hines Allen sustained his concussion. And so even before that. But the point is that with Robertson Harris and Eric Armstead taking more snaps at the edge than we might have expected a few months ago, then maybe that opens up more opportunities for Mason Smith. Louis asked, what about Coach Lasso? Is he being considered? I don't even have a response. Sure. Wrong football, but yeah, I get anyone can be on the list. Dell asked, any insight on how Adonai Mitchell has been playing? I think it's similar to the rookie that I just talked about, Mason Smith, where it's kind of about consistency. And he's had some amazing flashes, but it's really just about getting the rookie playing better on a down-to-down basis, which you can say about pretty much every rookie, really. But it's true. But for Adonai Mitchell, it's not that I've seen a lot of him, but it's really just about down-to-down consistency in terms of effort, I think. Not that he's showing a lot of effort, which is something that went back to his Texas days, but just about running each route with the determination and then being able to run a bunch of different routes is the biggest thing, because with Josh Downs being out for the past month, he's going to play in this game, but he had a ankle sprain that he was dealing with, and he's the main slot guy for the Colts. And so Mitchell was getting more work out of the slot, and then he's kind of trying to fight Alec Pierce for the downfield role, but then they also want to use him as an intermediate mid-range Mamba too. And so there's a lot on his plate basically. And so I'm not trying to say that he's not trying hard or anything like that, but there's a little bit more on his plate because he's asked to do a bunch of different things in terms of running routes and just his role in the offense, as opposed to being pigeonholed and being okay, all we need you to do is just these couple routes a couple times a game to kind of ease him in. So he's not really being eased in. But I will say that his route running is outrageous. There's a stat out there from Fantasy Points called average separation score, aka ASS. And I don't think that a fantasy website is honestly the best source for advanced tracking or advanced data or anything like that. But I know that Adonai Mitchell ranks top 5 in their separation metric. And so if you rank top 5 in a metric, then chances are you're pretty good at whatever that metric is attempting to track. And so that, again, metric is attempting to track separation. So Adonai Mitchell has definitely generated separation. I know that there's a few plays that Anthony Richardson missed him for should have been touchdowns earlier in the season. And so I think Adonai Mitchell is someone, again, who's still trying to find his consistency, but if he ended up having a 40-yard catch or a big play against the Jaguars, I would not be surprised. 100 miles per hour said Richardson will destroy man coverage with his legs. That's a good point. We have seen Nielsen go more towards zone defenses, especially since the second half of the Bills game, just because they don't really have the horses to play man coverage, especially with Darnell Savage and Jarian Jones knocked up, but mostly with Tyson Campbell on short-term injured reserve with a hamstring. And so, yeah, when you play man coverage, the defensive backs are all just worried about the guy that they're covering. And so they typically have their eyes away from the quarterback as opposed to in zone coverage when defenders are looking right at the quarterback. And so it's easier for quarterbacks to run as 100 miles per hour, saying against man coverage. But it'll be interesting to see what Nielsen does with like the man versus zone splits, because he's definitely going against a much less scary quarterback in whether it's Anthony Richardson or Joe Flacco, as opposed to Josh Allen and CJ Stroud in the past 2 weeks. But I'm interested to see in like how much zone versus man is run, because on one hand, it makes sense to go more towards zone when, again, you don't have the horses to run as much tight man-to-man, one-on-one coverage. But at the same time, Coach Campo made this point on his Campo and Joe podcast this week on 10XL Jaguars YouTube pages and channels, that because the Jaguars, like their scheme defensively going into the season was very man-heavy, like that's what they've practiced the most. And so part of the reason, like I think the Jags have held up fairly well under zone in the past 6 or 7 quarters, but it's a tough ask for the players because they were just coached up so much in man coverage. And so I'm sure the Jags are going to want to go back to a man-heavy attack as soon as Tyson Campbell is available. But I wonder if even as soon as this week against kind of a lesser quarterback compared to what we saw the last 2 weeks, if Nielsen kind of goes back to his man-to-man tendencies. Jags Shorts Talk asked Blue coming on. It's crazy how many people love Baloo. Not that you shouldn't. Like, Baloo's great. I love Rick, but it's just funny that, like, this is definitely not the only guy that's been like, when's Rick Baloo coming on the show? So I will definitely try to make sure we get Rick on in the near future. Jag Shorts Talk also asked, do you think Buster should be corner over Darby when Campbell comes back? No. I understand that Darby had the worst game of the season and a pretty bad game last week since he was mostly covering Nico Collins, who had what felt like 300 yards against the Jags and is easily leading the entire league in receiving yards by a mile. But even after last Sunday, I still have more faith in Darby, and a lot of that has to do with experience, where Darby has been in the league for like 10 plus years or something like that, maybe 9 years. And Buster, aka Monteric Brown, is in his second or third year, and so I don't know. Monteric Brown has certainly played very, very well, especially as a guy like coming in because of injury. But Darby's my guy. I still have a little bit more trust in him, and I think that Darby will look a lot better when like more pieces around him are healthy, because he's almost a little bit of a one-man show right out there right now, the way that Tyson Campbell has been in the past. Jag Shorts Talk also asked, why hasn't Jordan Jefferson played? Looks good in camp. I mean, I haven't I don't know. My assumption would be the same reason as Mason Smith, where it's about kind of consistency. But I don't know. Jordan Jefferson is a 4th-round rookie who's really projected by a lot of draft experts to be more of like a 6th or 7th-round pick, or maybe even a priority UDFA ad. And so I don't know. I don't really think it's a big deal that Jordan Jefferson hasn't played a ton of snaps a month into the season. But once we get to like the bye week or the second half of the season, and if he's still not really doing anything, then maybe we can talk about it more then. Dell asked, how's Ketchup doing? Doing great, thank you. We just took her to training. Ketchup is my girlfriend's puppy, so basically my puppy too. And so, yeah, we just took her to training last night, trying to just figure out how to be polite in public. Not that Ketchup isn't, because she's perfect, but yeah, just trying to kind of calm her down and make sure that she knows who's wearing the pants, who's the boss. The Ketchup's great. Thanks for asking, Dell. 100 miles per hour said, maybe Tyler Lacey loses 15 pounds and becomes an edge monster and we get bulky bald. Maybe. I think that's about as good of a point to end the show. We've gone over an hour. Thank you to everyone who joined. We will be back on Sunday with the usual crew, Mia, Tommy, Hacker, breaking down Colts versus Jaguars, maybe Jacksonville's first win of the 2024 season. One more question Jag Shorts Talk asked, what record does this team have to finish up with in order to realistically see the playoffs? Maybe I was gonna say 8-9 and sneak in as a wild card team, but 8-9 would seem tough. So I'll go 9-8, which would be hysterical because the Jags have finished 9-8 in each of the last 2 years, and it was by very different circumstances. So if they had another 9-8 season where it was just completely different from the last 2 years, that would be pretty funny. And so I think 9-8, aka above a 500 record, is what they're going to need to get to in order to realistically have a chance. So yeah, that'll do it. Thanks again to everyone. See you next time.